This is a presentation over the beginning of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. So in the North, directly after the Civil War, this new industry starts to take off that we've been talking about the last couple of days. This gives way to what's called capitalism, which I'll get to in a second about what that is. If you remember, coal, iron, and lead, essentially coal, led the way to the Industrial Revolution. New ways of getting coal, discovery of more coal, as well as iron and lead, leads to steel, oil, and railroads. They all kind of help each other out. Better steel, better oil, and better railroads means you collect more coal, iron, and lead, which means that it took off very, very rapidly. And a bunch of new inventions come out of this as well. The light bulb, the telegraph, the typewriter, the lightweight cameras. You don't have those gigantic cameras anymore that take forever to work. Efficient automobiles, like the assembly line with Henry Ford, as well as the prototype airplane in the early 1900s with Orville and Wilbur Wright. This gives way to capitalism. Capitalism is where a country's trade and industry are controlled by the private sector and not controlled by the state, meaning that someone does not tell people what they should create. Someone does not say, you over there, you should make hot dogs for a living and you should be a doctor. No, you decide upon everything based off what the private market wants. If everybody wants hot dogs, then there's going to be a lot of hot dog vendors. That's capitalism. People that work in capitalism are called entrepreneurs. These are people that set up businesses in order to make a profit. On the left, there's Andrew Carnegie, who becomes very, very famous in the steel industry. And on the right, Bill Gates, another famous entrepreneur with Microsoft. Also, corporations and banks begin to develop rapidly in this new system of capitalism. Corporations are businesses owned by many different investors. These are what have stocks. Stocks are corporations, meaning that you go in, you buy a percentage of the company through a stock, and then you can help control the decisions that company makes. Banks, which were around before capitalism, but they become more prominent during this time period, they give out loans, which generates income for businesses because the businesses need loans in order to make money. And the banks make money by getting a percentage of those loans back. So everybody's making money. Capitalism is all about money. On the left there, you got J.P. Morgan Chase. We still have J.P. Morgan Chase Bank today, still around. All of this big business is attributed to the practice of laissez faire. Laissez faire is a government economic policy, which means hands off. It means that the government does absolutely nothing in order to regulate businesses, nothing at all. As a result, many monopolies form. A monopoly is where a company owns almost all or all of an industry. It's very, very commonplace in the late 1800s. For example, John D Rockefeller is going to own almost every single oil refinery in the entire United States, which means he can set prices to whatever he wants to set them to, and that's going to be a problem. So back to Andrew Carnegie for a second. Andrew Carnegie was born a poor Scottish immigrant, and we'll find that most of these big businessmen actually started out as poor or as first-generation immigrants or second-generation immigrants. He eventually becomes a multimillionaire. He controls every single step of steelmaking, which is called vertical integration. If you look at the bottom center kind of bolded area, vertical integration is where you control every single step from start to finish in production. In the steel example, that would be you control the iron mines, the steel mills that refine the iron, the railroads that transport all this iron around and steel around, as well as the shipping line, so after your steel is done, you send it out. So from the point where you start gathering the good to the point where you ship it out and make it, you have everything. That's vertical integration. Andrew Carnegie also supported the concept of the gossip of wealth. He thought, that goods, the more goods that you have, the more you should give back. Because he was born poor, he realized that the rich should help out the poor. However, you'll find here in a second that the poor that are actually working for him don't really have the greatest of conditions. There's also John D Rockefeller. John D Rockefeller was also poor when he was young. He's a second-generation immigrant. And he was an investor. He bought out all of the oil refineries, as I said before. This is called horizontal integration. Horizontal integration is where you control all of one level of production. So you control all oil refineries, for example. In our example with Carnegie, if you were a horizontal integration person, maybe you control all of the railroads, which is what Vanderbilt is eventually going to do. John D. Rockefeller also established what were called trusts. Trusts are where you have a group of corporations that are all run by one board of directors. Essentially, it's an organized monopoly. Again, a monopoly is where you control all of one business. A trust is where you have a bunch of different businesses, but they're all run by the exact same person, the exact same people. Basically, the same exact thing as a monopoly. Trusts were actually seen as a threat to free enterprise by a lot of people. Free enterprise meaning that privately owned businesses should compete freely. It's kind of hard to compete freely where one person controls everything and doesn't let anyone else get into business. This led to some rich people, some rich businessmen, to be called robber barons, people that were stealing from the people, big business, the evil big business, versus the captains of industry, which some people are going to praise these people for making America incredibly wealthy. Before World War I, the United States really isn't considered much of a world power, but they do start generating a lot of money, which is a first. The conditions in these factories were also very, very poor, though. There's no child labor laws during this time period. If you look on the right, you see a child there working in what appears to be a fairly dangerous, I believe that's a newspaper. I believe it's a newspaper thing, unless it's clothing. It looks like newspaper, though. There was very, very low pay, and there were no safety regulations. If you look at those machines over there, if you move your hand too close to one of those mechanisms, it's going to get chopped off, and that happened more often than you think it would. However, it did give a lot of people a lot of jobs. Remember, the reason why immigrants are coming to the United States is because there's a lot of jobs in the factories. So there's a reason why people would consider this might be a good thing. I mean, yes, there's poor conditions, but at least you're making money. The way that the rich justified these conditions and their lifestyle and the huge gap between the rich and the poor is through a concept called social Darwinism. This relates back to Charles Darwin, who was right before the Industrial Revolution. He came up with the idea of survival of the fittest, also called what's going to lead into evolution, where someone who has the best possible traits will move on, whereas if you don't have the best possible traits, you'll be left behind. It was applied to capitalism by the industrialists. The rich were the fittest. They were meant to lead. They survived. Whereas the poor did not deserve any better than what they had. Social Darwinism is applied to money, whereas Darwin himself is actually applied to race issues too. In the South, they're actually doing studies where they think that the black people are actually of a lesser race. They are not as evolved as the white person, which you can see there in the bottom right-hand corner. So sadly, Darwin's theories are applied to a lot of pretty radical ideas. So the people that go to stop this, to stop these different problems that are in factories, even though they're generating money, most people are not in the greatest of conditions. They begin to organize in what are called labor unions. Labor unions, their goal is where you have a group of people that all fight for workers' rights together. If everybody works together and says, hey, you need to give us better wages or better safety regulations or else we're not going to work for you anymore, that has a lot of power because there's a lot of strength in numbers. If one person says they're going to do that, they'll just fire you. But it's kind of hard to fire your entire labor pool if they're all united in one union. Most of the unions that you'll see, and you'll see them here in a second when you read through these different excerpts, most of them are actually going to be put down by the companies. There's so many immigrants coming into the United States that it's actually possible for them to fire all of their workers. They also have hired police forces, private police forces, as well as the government to come in and literally shoot them down, like as in they're blocking off the factory and they would just shoot and kill them and put new people in there. But their ideas are going to remain. You'll find that directly after this big part of the Industrial Revolution, which is what we're going to talk about next week, it's called the Progressive Era, there's going to be a lot of different reforms.